Bobby displays a rare kind of toughness, like Silvio, and it's interesting to mention Sil because Bobby and Silvio end up as Tony's two closest advisors, and Silvio clearly approves of Bobby's rise as he doesn't cause dysentery in the ranks like he did when Chrissy was upped, as I discussed in my Silvio analysis. Anyway, Bobby is tough, but he's gentle. His anger comes about when his family are put into jeopardy, like Tony insulting his wife or his children being put in danger by Paulie with the ride. He's an emotional man, loves his family. It takes a certain quality to allow ridicule of himself, early on at least, but to reserve his fury for when his family is affected. Think to that scene where he says to Junior, "I never ask you for anything," but he's desperate for his father not to perform the hit. As mentioned, he is actually very manly. I've no idea why Vito had such a problem with him in season 6, he should have greased his union. Take a look at this scene.
Boss put 18 plus on this, maybe 25.
Yeah?
What's your problem?
Nothing, I'm excited. What do you want?
Chris is shocked that Bobby is acting so stoic and isn't as visibly excited as he is. It's a great contrast for their characters. One is strong, masculine, handsome like George Raft, and Rubenesque to boot. And it's fitting that it's these two, because it's Chris who Bobby replaced in Tony's pecking order. All of a sudden that "to the victor belongs the spoils" quote doesn't sound so stupid. Bobby is the anti-Christopher. He steps up at precisely the time Tony sees that Chris is not his successor, and he now sees there is another viable option. He's reliable. He knows when to talk and when not to. He gets his collections on time and doesn't make stupid jokes. Not anymore, anyway. He evolved and grew, something which Chris failed to do. He's not an addict. He's not a snake like Paulie. He's not a rat like Puss. He's not unstable like Ralph. He's just a strong family man, a dedicated father and a loving husband. I'm in awe of him. He's what the other mobsters pretend to be, but behind the scenes they're having cheese graters used on their privates. Take another scene. Bobby meets with Tony to ask for better jobs. He sees him in his office in a professional capacity, rather than talk business at his home, using brother-in-law privileges. And he skips all the preambles that everyone else does, and he gets straight to the point, without asking for any special treatment, only an opportunity to earn more. You know, honestly, now that I think about it, had he not died, I could actually see Bobby becoming boss after Tony. Sounds crazy, but he had all the qualities, and Silvio showed he wasn't suited for it anyway. Bobby was the next best thing. Bobby is always aware of Tony. It would be interesting to see what Bobby's like when Tony's not in the picture. He sure started acting vulture-like when Silvio was acting boss, which is something I discussed in the Silvio video. For sure, at the very least, Gangster Bobby is terrifying, like when he goes after Paulie and has to be held back, or when he squares up to Paulie at the Bing. Like they say, it's the quiet ones you have to watch out for. If you're lost in Pine Barrens and the mob is after you, in all seriousness, the marksman Bobby with a bow and arrow, with the hunting training and killer instincts of his father, is probably the last person you want on your tail. Chris and Paulie struggle to nab the Russian, but Bobby could probably shoot Ginny's mole off from miles away. And after he shoots you, he'll probably fucking eat you. Although he did shoot someone in the ass when he was going for the fleshy part of the thigh, but perhaps that was on purpose after he got shortchanged by the rapper. Hooking up with Janice was a major part of Bobby's downfall. As she did with Richie, she would have been the one egging him on to make more money, to increase his standing. Rather embarrassingly, sometimes she came directly to Tony to vouch for her husband. But the push to up Bobby put him on the radar of the likes of New York. He was in the meeting with Phil Leotardo when even Paulie wasn't. From a mobster's perspective, he could have been content as being a middle tier guy, someone like Benny. He'd have time for his trains and his children, but in his vulnerability, he allowed himself to get manipulated by Janice. She obviously did good for him, mob hierarchy wise, but long term, it destroyed Bobby. Even he himself recognized a change was taking place. As he says, "This used to be a good house." In a way, Bobby was eaten by his surroundings. His first wife may have kept him on the path, because their relationship was one of love, it was wholesome. She might have not been the most materialistic of people, which meant Bobby was content with his position, but then she dies. Even her death itself may have hardened Bobby. The scene where he threatens the Union guy was shortly after. Perhaps the grief inspired him. But through Janice's pushing, he became a more effective mobster but a worse person. By mob standards, Bobby is tragic because he started off as a happy, successful family man whose family was torn apart, starting with the tragic death of his wife and the insertion of Janice into his life. He doesn't realize it before it's too late, but as his stature rises, he slowly loses everything. As Boardwalk Empire told us, you can't be half a gangster. And eventually Bobby goes all the way, going from the best of a bad bunch, no Gumar, loving father and husband, to becoming just like the rest of them. He loses his innocence with his first murder, and I couldn't stand how obnoxious he became, sucking up to Tony in typical mob subordinate fashion like the 200k line, instead of the old Bobby who actually spoke his mind to Tony, or not shaking hands with the guy on the site. It also looks like he started to sleep with the strippers from the club. You do see one with him when Chris is getting roasted, but this was after he hooked up with Janice, so he gets a pash for that. Bobby Bacala is a character who never needed to big himself up and show how much of a gangster he was, but his actions throughout the show quietly assured those willing to see that he was indeed a force to be reckoned with. I mean, look at the way he talked to Tony after the fight, trying to play it down and mitigate the situation. Obviously he was also thinking about his safety, but he could easily have taken Tony's bait once again, if his ego had let him. I do wonder though, how much of Bobby in Season 6B was him actually having changed, and how much he was actually playing up to Tony. I prefer thinking that his comment about Hesh's 200k to Tony was him trying to suck up to the man to stay firmly in his good books. I like to think the old Bobby was in there somewhere, but in all honesty, I think we lost the endearing Bacala that we had in earlier seasons. Bobby dies as a murdering gangster, estranged from his son as implied by his tragic last line, which carries a lot of weight about where the relationship is between father and son.
Your son will like this too. Looks fast.
He don't care.
Bobby's death scene is probably the best shot hit in the show, and I don't want to talk about it too much here because it deserves its own video, but it's quite fitting, symbolically, that he dies buying an 8,000 toy train set. Throughout the series, we see examples of those in the life trading their souls for shiny toys and objects, their love of materialism overpowering and eventually taking over their morality. Tony and his boat, even though he's had so many conversations with Dr. Melfi. Carmela and her jewellery, even though she was warned by the psychiatrist. Chris's jaw-dropping at the luxury lounge, and choosing to give up Adriana when he sees that family at the gas station, even though the two had a great relationship. And here is Bobby, with his toys, ostensibly more innocent by comparison but just as corrupting. In the end, he is murdered by an incredibly expensive child's toy that he knows his son no longer cares about. He traded his soul for something valueless. He chose the life over having a real life. He lost what's actually important, and on top of that, he knows it. It also feels like him yearning for that simpler, nostalgic time when it was just him, Karen, Sophia, and Junior, a happy family whose boys enjoyed playing with their trained toys. But now, Karen's dead, replaced with Janice. Junior has no interest in he and his father's old hobbies, and Sophia is now in the hands of Janice now that Bobby is dead. And finally, there's quite an irony in Bacala saying, you probably don't even hear it when it happens. When he did hear it, he did see it, and he holds his shiny toy in his hand as he's gunned down.